Guess what, Lions? For as little as $5 a month, you can get access to exclusive bonus audio content and help this program grow by joining the Lions of Liberty Pride. To learn more, head over to lionsofliberty.com/support.
Welcome to Felony Friday, a presentation of the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here is your host, John Odermatt.
Felons, friends, and freedom lovers, it is great to have you back here with me for another edition of Felony Friday here on the Lions of Liberty podcast. Felony Friday, for those of you who don't know, we do a weekly look at injustice here in the criminal justice system. And this is one of 3 shows we have here on the Lions of Liberty podcast. We have a show every Monday hosted by Mark Claire, where he interviews leading minds in the liberty movement, where he hosts roundtable discussions. And then every Wednesday, we have our newest show, Electric Liberty Land, hosted by Brian McWilliams, a weekly shot of culture, comedy, and liberty. Brian is doing an awesome job with that show. It's really entertaining. And you can get all 3 of these shows by subscribing to one podcast feed, the Lions of Liberty podcast. Go to iTunes, go to Stitcher, and subscribe, and you get all 3 of these shows. 3 for the price of 1, except there's no price. It's free. So that's even better, right? This is the 90th episode of Felony Friday. So that means you're going to be able to find the show notes with links and notes to everything that I'm going to talk about with my guest today at lionsofliberty.com/FF90. Let's get right into this interview. My guest today on Felony Friday is Shane Claiborne. Shane is a Christian activist and author who is one of the founding members of the intentional community, The Simple Way, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's a graduate of Eastern University, where he studied sociology and youth ministry. Shane has an impressive resume, and just to name a couple things, he worked alongside Mother Teresa during a 10-week term in Calcutta, and he spent 3 weeks in Baghdad with the Iraq peace team, where he took daily trips to sites where there have been bombings, visited hospitals and families, and attended worship services during the war. Shane was featured in the documentary The Ordinary Radicals, and he co-directed the 3-volume Another World is Possible series. In 2011, he declared his unwillingness to pay taxes to fund U.S. military interventions, and he did this by withholding a portion of his income taxes that was meant to correspond with the percentage that the federal government would spend on military, and instead he donated that money to charity. And Shane is the author of the book Executing Grace: How the Death Penalty Killed Jesus and Why It's Killing Us. Shane, thank you for coming on Felony Friday.
Yeah, man, it's great to be with you, and I'm glad to be able to share some thoughts on your show here, man.
Well, thanks for coming on. I know you have a busy schedule, so it's great to get a little time with you. And like we talked about, most of the time I do want to talk about the death penalty and your view on it, the Christian view on it, and why it's the right view to be against the death penalty. In the first place that I heard about you, a listener of this show sent me your appearance on Bob Murphy's Christian Libertarian podcast. So that's the first I heard of you, and I've been listening to a couple of your shows ever since then. And I know you don't identify as a libertarian, but the more I've gotten to know about your background, I think we do align in a couple areas, most notably with the anti-war stance, and also being against funding the war, which I think a lot of libertarians would agree with that. And I'd like to talk about that later on in the show if we have time. But like I said, let's start out with, if we can, by talking about the death penalty. So
absolutely. Hey, there's worse things I've been called than a libertarian, let me tell you. No.
Hey. That might not go over well with the audience here. I'm just kidding. But I think, a good place to start, let's start with the death penalty. And I'm curious myself, because I don't know if I've heard you really talk about this. How did your view of the death penalty evolve? Was there some sort of specific moment or a case that moved you to really take another look at this?
Oh, absolutely. And I should start by saying I spent a lot of my life in favor of the death penalty, not only in favor of it, but convinced that it was ordained by God and had its roots in Scripture. And there are a lot of things that shifted in me, but I'll say it began by hearing the stories of people who were directly affected by the death penalty. And now many of them are my friends. I had the honor of sharing many of their stories in Executing Grace, but I have gotten to know many people who were wrongfully convicted and put on death row for crimes they had nothing to do with. Friends like my friend Derek Jameson, who spent 20 years on death row, had 6 execution dates, saw dozens of his friends executed before finally forcing the prosecution to release all the evidence. And 34 pieces of evidence proved his innocence, and he was released. And so it's stories, like those of those who were innocent and wrongfully convicted that raised a question for me of how much we trust our government, with the irreversible power of life and death, imperfect institutions that you can't undo. You can't bring someone back from the dead. And yet we know for every 9 executions that we've gone through with, there's been 1 exoneration. I mean, that's a terrible record. If 1 of every 10 planes that took off crashed, we'd be like, whoa, let's stop flying, ground the planes, So I think there's that issue. But there's also the connection between. It's impossible to talk about the death penalty without also talking about our history around race and slavery. The states that have held on to the death penalty the longest are the same states that held on to slavery the longest. Where executions are happening today is exactly where lynchings were happening 100 years ago. And so there's definitely this kind of descendancy from lynching to the death penalty. And just to give you one more snapshot of that, in 1950, African Americans were like 22% of the population in the U.S., but they were 75% of all executions were African Americans. And you kind of fast forward 70 years or so, and African Americans are about 13% of the population, but they still make up almost half of death row, and over a third of all executions are African Americans. And so I think we can see, sometimes we're thinking, well, there's just those cases where it's the worst of the worst, and we need to hold out the possibility of the death penalty. And yet, the closer you look, you see that we're not killing the worst of the worst. We're killing the poorest of the poor, and often people of color. That some of the biggest determinants of who actually gets executed is not the atrocity of the crime, but it's the resources of the defendant, the race of the victim, and things like geography, where the crime was committed. So there's so many different things as I really leaned into this issue. But this is the other thing, is that when it comes to the death penalty, it wouldn't stand a chance in America if it weren't for Christians. That Christians have been the moral backbone and the theological justification for the death penalty. So while the states in the Confederacy are where the death penalty happens, it's also the Bible Belt is the death belt. And that breaks my heart, because the more I look at Jesus and the more I look at Scripture, I see that the message couldn't be further from that. And the message at the heart of my faith as a Christian is no one is beyond redemption. That Jesus came not for the righteous, but for the sinners, for those who are, and you look at Scripture, and one of the first murderers was none other than Moses. He killed a man in the book of Exodus. And David killed Uriah to cover up the terrible things he did with Bathsheba. Saul of Tarsus, went door to door trying to kill and torture Christians. And so I believe, grace gets the last word, and the Bible would be a lot shorter without it. So, I really hope more and more Christians will be on the right side of history on this issue.
Why do you think it is that so many Christians favor the death penalty? Are they basing it on the Bible? Are they misinterpreting teachings in the Bible?
Absolutely, I think so. I think I still have a very high view of Scripture, and I think that's part of the problem is a certain way of reading Scripture where we say, well, the death penalty is in Scripture. But as you look closer at the specifics of the death penalty in the Old Testament, it wasn't just capital murder that you had the death penalty for, but there are over 30 death-worthy crimes, which included different forms of sexual immorality. It included even things like working on the Sabbath. I mean, I think a lot of folks would be in trouble. I always say everybody but Chick-fil-A would be in trouble, because they close on Sunday. But, like disrespecting your parents, these were capital crimes. And so I think we've read the Scripture in a certain light. And there is this precedent in Scripture of one way of thinking about justice, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And we've misunderstood. That's one of the most well-known verses of the Bible, and I think it's also one of the most misused verses of the Bible, because it was a very ancient way, a philosophy of justice that you could do reciprocal harm. So inasmuch as someone harmed you, you could return that harm, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But we've come to see it as a license for revenge, which I think is exactly the opposite of what its intention was. It was meant to limit retaliation. So, someone broke your arm, you couldn't go break both of their arms and burn down their mom's house. I mean, it was to stop the spiral of violence. And we think in our world today, you think, wow, we wouldn't actually break someone's arm that broke a person's arm. We don't rape people who rape to show that rape is wrong. But somehow in the most extreme case of murder, we still hold out this idea that you can kill someone to show that killing is wrong. And I think a lot of us are questioning that, because you mirror the very evil that was done to you. You exacerbate the wounds. You create a new set of victims, and it doesn't bring the promises of closure and things like that. And it's murder victims' families, family members that have taught me that. And they're some of the most amazing people that have endured things I can't even imagine, that have taught me there are better ways forward to honor the victims of violence without creating more violence. And of course, let me say too that there's Jesus here, and my friend Dale Resinelli says every pro-death penalty Christian has the nagging problem of Jesus to deal with, because Jesus says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you this, he says, Moses told you this, but I tell you this, you may have a right to return that harm, but don't even do it. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right. And I think that idea that we can do better than harming the person who harmed us is one of the core teachings of Jesus. I still love the Scripture, and I love diving back into it. And it's actually become a big part of my momentum in opposing the death penalty.
Something you touched on right there, talking about the families of victims who've really been pushed aside, not been listened to, not been given a voice when they've spoken out against the people that actually either harmed or killed one of their loved ones, saying that they don't want that person to have the death penalty. Are there specific cases of this that you can cite?
There's tons of specific cases, and I cite some of them in my book. One of them is someone who's become an incredible friend and a hero of mine, Suzanne Bossler, who her dad was a pastor, and their home was invaded, and this man stabbed her father to death. And stabbed her multiple times in the head. She actually kind of faked her own death in order to survive the scene. And she came away from that still deeply compelled that violence wasn't the solution. Violence was the problem. And her dad, being a pastor, she said he would never want to be he would never want me to honor his life by trying to take someone else's life. So she, during the sentencing, stated her opinion that she didn't want the death penalty for the person that they knew had perpetrated the crime. In court, she was absolutely silenced. In fact, the judge threatened her with contempt of court, obstruction of justice, and she was told she could be jailed and given fines if she voiced her opinion on the death penalty. And that's an extreme case, but there's all kinds of iterations of that where victims who didn't fit the narrative of a victim that was for the death penalty, that said, I want justice for the person that did this. And by that, they mean execution. When it doesn't fit that narrative, that person is really pushed aside or silenced, sometimes with an official gag order. Other times they're just not given the same platform and services, and because it's the state seeking the death penalty. So if the victim's family isn't in line with that, then their voice is really marginalized, which goes on just to continue to exacerbate those wounds and to sort of the helplessness that you feel already as a victim anyway. So we've even had cases where the court ruled that the immediate family members were not victims in the traditional sense of the word victim, because they had to have a category for saying these people don't fit our narrative.
Something that I think in my personal evolution because I used to, like you, I used to be in favor of the death penalty, in favor of, I thought it was justice, the right thing to do. And I think where I started to evolve was when I looked at abortion. I'm pro-life regarding abortion, and I've heard you talk about this too, that being consistently pro-life across the board, even with people that have committed horrible acts. And a way that I look at it is, even though someone has committed a horrible act, killed someone, if you're in favor of stomping out their life and ending their life, you are essentially saying that they can't add there's no chance of them adding any value. There's no chance of them turning their life around. Is that something that you think would resonate with Christians looking at it from that perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I heard someone recently say the only place that you can be pro-death penalty, pro-war, pro-guns, pro-drones, and still call yourself pro-life is America. And so I think one of the most urgently needed things is a consistent ethic of life, to say that every single person is made in the image of God and of immeasurable value, and anything that squashes that life and that dignity is destroying God's image in the world. But the problem is we don't have a political party or platform or candidates that are operating under that umbrella. And I think that's part of I think, what really surfaced in this last election, where you have many people that are just voting on one issue. But for me, I think what's deeply troubling is that pro-life has come often just mean anti-abortion or pro-birth. But I think to be pro-life means that's what compels me in so much of our work. Pro-life it means standing against abortion. It also means standing against gun violence and standing for Black lives and being a part of the movement for Black lives and standing against militarism and war, caring for the creation. I think all that can come under an umbrella of pro-life, and we really, really need that. I'm seeing a lot of studies among young people and young Christians in particular, that is their operating framework, is an ethic of life, or as we like to say, pro-life from womb to tomb, from the cradle to the grave, that we really believe in that.
You were talking before about being skeptical of state intervention, and as libertarians, my audience is going to be on board with that. I think, though, that a lot of Christians really, in my experience, a lot of Christians that I've met and talked with, is that they favor state intervention as long as it influences people in a direction that they agree with. And the problem with that is you find yourself intervening in people's lives, not really in a loving way, in a way that could actually really help them, but in a way from a third party, from the state coming in, using force, using coercion to change their actions. Is this where does that come from? Where did Christians get off track going to the state in order to try to change people for the better, or did they get off track? Is that something you think that for the majority of Christians are in the wrong with that perspective?
Well, I don't know the exact date, but I have a hunch it was around 1600 years ago, and because I think that what did happen was you had this marginalized movement of people who were largely persecuted by the state. Jesus that died at the hands of the state. The Roman Empire is this deep, oppressive, colonizing force in the world, and that group began to gain credibility and power, and the Christian movement began to embrace some of that power and moved from being the persecuted to the persecutors, kind of exchanged the cross for the sword. And there are some critiques that didn't happen in a moment. It happened in a movement over time. But I believe that what was so beautiful and is so beautiful about Christianity at its best is we are aligning our lives with this person who was born a refugee. Jesus was born in the middle of a genocide by King Herod, killing the little boys in the land. He died executed on the cross, which was only a symbol of torture and horror and violence and intimidation and humiliation. And it's that's the framework for that. That's who we worship, And so I think we have lost our way and said, we actually want some of that power, and we end up losing sight of, I think, where our primary allegiance is. And I think being a Christian is very much about having our identity transformed by Christ. And so our values are different. How we think about possessions are different. How we think about our enemies or violence or conflict is different, because we hear Jesus saying, love your enemies. And I've come to just find it impossible to love my enemies and simultaneously prepare to kill them. So I think it causes us to be peculiar people in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be nice to see Christians as leaders in putting an end to the death penalty and putting an end to the war on drugs and putting an end to a lot of these things that have really torn this country apart and really caused some division in this country, especially along racial lines with the war on drugs. So yeah, hopefully that's something that can change. That's one of the reasons that I do this podcast. But
I think so. I mean, I think mass incarceration is the kind of evolution from slavery to mass incarceration is certainly one of the most urgent things in our world. I mean, it's not just mass incarceration, but I think, the Confederate monuments, there's, all kinds of hatred and white supremacy that's out there right now. So we need to be a force, for love and for healing. And the beginning of that healing, I think, is being honest about our history and what we've done to African Americans and Native people. And now, the reality is 1 in 3 African-American boys born today, 1 in 3 can expect to go to prison unless something changes. So, I mean, that is that has an urgency to it that we can't just remain apathetic through this time.
Absolutely. And you're a guy that not only has, got involved in positive change in the United States here in your local community, you've also gone across the globe. You've spent time in Iraq, in Baghdad, and I'm curious what led you to want to go over to Baghdad with the Iraq peace team.
Well, it may kind of feel like we're all over the world on these topics, but the fact is they're very integrated. They intersect. And Dr. Martin Luther King said the giant triplets in the world today, he said this 50 years ago, Dr. King said the giant triplets are racism, materialism, and militarism. And I think, my gosh, like part of what led me to Iraq, originally was hearing about families that had lost their loved ones in 9/11. And one of the things that this group, September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, did was they got together as a support group to grieve 9/11. But then as they saw the response of the war in Iraq, their prayer became, our grief is not a cry for war. And they went on delegations as murder victims' family members from 9/11. Like they went to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they came back with these incredible stories of healing and truth telling, and people that in Iraq and Afghanistan that sent gifts back to the families that had lost their loved ones in 9/11. And to me, that looked redemptive. It looked a lot like Jesus. And so I went to Iraq, and the first time I went was in March of 2003. Which we didn't exactly know at the time, but I ended up being there during the shock and awe campaign, during the bombing of Baghdad. And I was there with an amazing group of people that included doctors and nurses and veterans and pastors, grandmothers and students. And we volunteered in hospitals. We met with Iraqi families. And we basically said, no matter what our government does to your country, we want to continue to stand against all violence and to be here with you. And so we saw some really horrific things, but I also experienced some of my deepest, most transformative encounters with grace and humility and hope.
So did that experience or how much of that experience caused you to want to take this next step that I'm going to talk about, where you actually walk the walk, where you put your money where your mouth was and really took on the IRS, took on the federal government, and by withholding a portion of your taxes, that you figured out what percentage would go to the military budget?
So there's the whole faith side of this too. I should say that when the bombs started falling on Baghdad, we gathered for a prayer meeting with thousands of Christians from all over Iraq and in that region. And one of the things that they did was they pointed to the cross and they said, this cross doesn't make any sense to the smart bombs or the ways of this world, but it teaches us another way to interact with violence without becoming violent. And everybody sang Amazing Grace in Arabic. And I was so moved, I went up to one of the bishops and I said, I had no idea that there were so many Christians in Iraq. And I'll never forget this bishop's response. He goes, yeah, this is where Christianity started. And then he says, this is the land of your ancestors. He pointed down the street and he goes, the Garden of Eden was right down there. Do you understand that? And he said, you didn't invent Christianity in America. You guys just domesticated it. And he said, you go back and you tell the church in America that we are praying for them to remember who they are. So that was an amazing thing. But what I also learned in Iraq was not just about my own faith, but I learned about the roots of some of this violence that we see in the world. And one Iraqi man, he said to me, well, you know that Saddam Hussein has some weapons because you have the receipts from them in your country. And, I came to find out that the Bell helicopters that Saddam Hussein used to gas the Kurds, this horrific thing that he did, they came from the United States. And you start to take a closer look at this and you see that the U.S. has dealt weapons to like 80% of the world. And then we see those weapons turned on us at some points. And it's kind of like if I were selling guns to kids in my neighborhood and going, don't use them. Here's a gun. I'm going to make a little quick money, but don't shoot anybody, and certainly don't shoot us, And Jesus said, you pick up the sword, you die by the sword. And I think we've seen the truth of that over and over. So that's certainly one of the things, as many of the people there had lived through the Iran-Contra scandal where, we've made money off of these conflicts. Even to this day, we're still, does anybody wonder why we're still selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, right? Like 15 of the 19 folks that we know were responsible for 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. And we've devastated Iraq and Afghanistan and still sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. So I think you see that. And in our own budget, Dr. King said a country that spends more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching a spiritual death. And I look at the disproportionate amount of money that's going towards militarism. And outside of the budget, too, I just think of the atrocity of these weapons, that there are, around 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and we own half of them. That limits our credibility when we talk about, North Korea or Iran or whatever. It is the only country that's ever used a nuclear weapon on a civilian population is us, and we did it twice in 1 week. We killed hundreds of thousands of people. And now we have the capacity of 50,000 Hiroshima bombs. I mean, it only takes my understanding is it only takes 100 nuclear weapons to make the world uninhabitable. And we have the capacity of 50,000 Hiroshima bombs. And you think, I'm not even sure that we should have one of those, much less, how many times do we need to blow up the world? And how much do we trust our government? How much do we trust Donald Trump or anyone else with that power? So, yeah, it raises some really important issues for me, both as a human being, but also especially as a follower of Jesus, who's the Prince of Peace, and said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be, called the children of God.
So what response have you gotten from the IRS?
Well, so what I did was I did withhold the portion of my money that would go towards military spending, and I donated it to groups working for peace. And it was interesting. I believe in transparency. So I wrote a letter fully disclosing that and saying, I'm willing to voluntarily suffer the consequences of whatever, the blowback is from that. So my first letter was really interesting. It said we're still considering what you've told us. So I got this letter back. It was basically like, give us a little more time. And then my next letter was, we've done a thorough review of this and we found that we owe you money. And I was like, well, that's the irony. I mean, now my dilemma became like, am I going to cash a check from the IRS, or from the government? But I guess they said that I made such little income, I qualified for, some kind of rebate. I don't know. But the point being, some of my Christian brothers and sisters will say, well, the scripture says give to Caesar what's Caesar's. But what happens in that encounter in the Gospels is incredible. It's a beautiful, stunning story where the tax collectors come to Jesus and they say, where are your taxes? And he tells them to go get a fish and it'll have the money in its mouth. And it makes a whole parody of the power, and it makes a spectacle even of their question, because he goes, it's kind of like, oh, Caesar can have the coins he made with his image on them. Like, I made the fish, I made the creation, and I love it because it transcends that and says, what is Caesar's, and I love how Dorothy Day says, once we've given to God what's God's, there's not a whole lot left for Caesar. And in the end, I think the question is, what is Caesar entitled to? And I don't think that we should give Caesar the power over life and death.
I agree with you there. And Shane, I really want to thank you for coming on the show and spending time with my audience here and sharing. This has been a lot of fun for me. And I just want to give you the opportunity now to talk about and share where my audience can find your work, where they can learn more about you, where they can buy your book.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope folks that use social media, you can sure join me. I try to keep folks updated on Facebook and Twitter at my name, Shane Claiborne. And you can see more information on books and my travel schedule and everything on my website, shaneclaiborne.org. So we've got a whole bunch of different speakers and writers that all contribute on a website called redletterchristians.org, and you can find us there too.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Shane.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, man.
I hope you guys enjoyed today's interview with Shane Claiborne. You had a lot of fun talking to him, and I know this is a very controversial subject. The death penalty, always controversial. Last time I talked about it on Felony Friday, probably over a year ago, I got a lot of feedback in the forum. A lot of libertarians, conservatives, saying how in favor, how they would never waver, and how in favor they were of the death penalty, and in circumstances like murder and rape and just horrible, heinous crimes, how they could never imagine moving from that position. So I know that obviously everyone that listens is not a Christian like myself. I know everyone is not going to be moved, obviously, by Shane's arguments, by biblical arguments, by things like that. But I think even within those arguments, there is a lot of things that can be taken away, a lot of common sense, a lot of rational viewpoints on this. And I think that the clearest way to look at this from a libertarian perspective is Shane cited out of every 10 people who are, who go to death row and who are put to death, who receive the death penalty, one of those people is exonerated. So you got a 90% correct rate as far as the stats say. That's terrible, and that's unacceptable. But it's not surprising for anyone who listens to this show with any regularity. You have a great understanding of how flawed and unjust our criminal justice system is. How it's not set up to actually get to the root and find the truth of what happened in a case. So often, far too often, it's just set out to prove the prosecutors, the state's narrative, to validate that. They're not looking for truth. They're looking to justify their actions. They're looking to justify their response. They're looking to justify their narrative of the case, what they believe happened. And that's not to say that doesn't align sometimes with the truth, but the way our system is set up, unfortunately, it's easy for that to miss the mark. It's easy for free people to end up in prison, to spend a life in prison, to be put on death row. It happens far too often, and as Shane pointed out, it happens far more often to minorities, to people of color, than it does to white people. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the bottom line is, this is something that has to change. And I think, me personally, and maybe I'm wrong, I think libertarians and Christians, I know you're not all Christians, but I'm a Christian, should be leaders on this, because I think it's clear. I think it's decisive. I think it's a very principled stance to be taken here. That's all I'm going to say on that. I encourage you all to check out Shane's work. Been on several podcasts. Check out his appearance on Bob Murphy's Christian Libertarian podcast. That was really, really good episode. And Bob gets more into asking questions about the scripture, about the Bible. Bob gets more into it from that perspective, because that's his show is a Christian show. So if you're coming at it looking for more of that background, I'll put Bob's show on the show notes page. So check that out. And guys, if you enjoy this show, if you like what we're doing here, if you like Mark's show on Monday, Brian's show on Wednesday, my show on Friday, if you like just one of them or all three of them, and if you want to hear more, if you want us to expand the reach of this show, if you want this show to actually have the impact that we believe it can have, then we need your help. And I'm not saying that lightly. It's a fact. We need your help. We're at a point right now where we have a lot of people in our support group, in our Lions of Liberty Pride, the people that donate to us every month, which helps us to keep the lights on, Lions of Liberty, we bought new recording equipment, stuff like that. But we're at the point now, if we want to grow, we need more people. We need more people in the Pride. We need more funds in order to advertise, in order to do things like that. So you can do that at 3 levels, $25, $10, or $5. $25, you get all the bells and whistles. You get a monthly conference call with us, which we have coming up very soon here this month. You get 2 free t-shirts, free koozie, huge discount at the Lions of Liberty store. And you get in our secret Facebook group. $10, you don't get the conference call, but you get everything else. You get 1 free t-shirt. You get a little bit less of a discount in the store. $5, you don't get the free stuff. You do get all of our exclusive content, which you get the exclusive content, obviously, at the $10 and $25. And our exclusive content, we have a recurring conspiracy theory roundtable. We've had several episodes of that. Extra episodes of this show, Felony Friday. We'll play Is This a Crime a couple times just for the Pride members. Look at some cases there. And we have all kinds of stuff. Mark often has his guests on, and we'll let the Pride members ask extra questions. We'll publish that just to the Pride. We'll release episodes early to the Pride. So it's great, and it's for just $5 a month. You can get it all. And the biggest thing is really, it's nice. It's extra content for you. But if you like this show and you want it to grow and get better, bigger, and to get huge, then we need more money and we need to grow. So I really want to encourage you to think about doing that. Go to lionsofliberty.com/support. Just one more note, guys. Please go to DonorC. DonorC is the DonorSee, founded by Greg Glyer. Outstanding app. It's a way to raise money for projects for people in need all across the world, where you can actually see your money go to work. Your donations don't get caught up in administrative waste and crap like that, like the Red Cross. They go right to the people in need. You get to see the project as it's done, as it's built. You get to see the people's lives change. It's an amazing, amazing app, and I want to encourage you to download it and find some projects you like and donate to them. We'll sponsor them from time to time. We have been sponsoring one for a listener of this show, Daniel Lee. Maybe that'll be funded by the time this airs. If it's not, then definitely donate to Daniel Lee's project. Him and his family members had some pretty bad damage from that flooding in Houston several weeks ago. So check that out. And that's all I got, guys. I really want to thank you for listening to today's show. This is John Odermatt signing off. Always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.